Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining Heather and myself. As Helen has said, we work on the HCS1, which is the Human Capital Standards Committee for the BSI, and represent the UK at ISO TC260, which is the committee that looks after human resource management standards. So today, what I want to do is really just share with you how human resource management or human capital management standards contribute towards building back better. Okay, the first thing I wanted to do was to start the session with a thought experiment. And very soon you're going to be asked to vote. Let me just give you the context. So this is a thought experiment where we're on a plane, it makes an emergency landing, and it breaks into 3 parts. The cabin fills with smoke. Everybody realizes on the plane that they have to get out. Now, on planet A, the passengers turn to one another and say, do you need help? And help each other out of that plane. So all those who need assistance get off first, and people are willing to give their lives even for perfect strangers. On planet B, everyone fends for themselves. Panic breaks out. There's a lot of pushing and shoving. Children, the elderly, they get trampled in the process. So you're going to move very quickly to a poll. Do you think we live on planet A, or do you think we live on planet B? We'll give you 30 seconds. Three, two, one. Thank you. So 3/4 of you think we live on planet B, and 1/4 of you say we live on planet A. And actually, if you look at the evidence, most of us live on planet B. You may ask, you may just ask yourself, when the pandemic hit, the kind of community support that people volunteered, to set up support groups, community groups, that kind of decency, that kind of kindness was not an unusual happening. You find that in times of chaos and difficulty, people actually come together. We saw that in World War II. We saw that in Katrina, where actually people started building community support groups to help one another. And at the time, in that chaos, the police actually said that there was lots of crime and so on. But after Katrina had settled down, then they looked at the statistics. In the Superdome, nobody died because of violence. 6 people died during that whole crisis. 4 from natural causes, 1 from suicide, and 1 from a drug overdose. Nobody died from violence. So you find that this kind of thinking is very common, because there is a psychological theory called veneer theory, that somehow civilization is veneer thin, and all you need is a little scratch and we all go back to our baser instincts. Of course, there are situations where that can happen, but by and large, people tend to be decent. So I'm going to go back to my slides. Thank you. So today we're talking about human capital, and I thought I would just clarify the definition, because many of you may not actually have encountered that term before. And so this is a definition from Richard Plowright and adapted by Valerie Anderson. It is a quotation which I took from this book, Human Capital Management Standards, A Complete Guide. And what it really says is that people are more than their labor. It is a sum total of everything that they bring to you, the whole person. So the other thing I wanted to ask you, and this time I won't do a poll, is just to have you reflect whether on a day-to-day basis, we operate more in system 1, which is fast, intuitive, emotional, or do we operate normally in system 2, where we're contemplative, slow and deliberate and rational? I'm sure many of us in professions would like to think that we work in system 2, that we weigh up the evidence, we deliberate and we discuss, we look at the weight for one course of action and another, and then make up our minds. But actually, through evolutionary psychology, we know that people operate in system 1 because oftentimes we need to survive, and we either, when faced with a danger, is flight or fight. And that is a very much hardwired into the way we operate. And many times we make decisions on the whole very quickly based on system 1. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to say was that we operate mainly in 1, and that means that having standards, one of the advantages of having standards is evidence-based standards, is that it forces us to reflect on our practice. It gives us a framework on which to think about what it is that we are doing. And that means that we look at evidence, we look at best available evidence, we then ask the right questions, we acquire the right evidence, we appraise that data, that information, we aggregate those sources, we apply it, then we assess to see how well these things operate. So each one, and the reason why I used the photograph of the UK cycling team is that each time we apply this knowledge and this technology, we are aiming for incremental gain. Some small advantage that then gives the organization a more productive outcome. But the incremental system, system 2, is one that requires rational thinking, it requires reflection, it requires weighing of evidence. It isn't a silver bullet, which is what we talk about in system 1. Okay. The danger is that we make assumptions. Can you see the next slide? Has it moved? It has, right?
No,
Yeah.
I don't think.
Not moved.
Okay, so the difficulty is that we make assumptions, just like we made the assumption about the kind of planet we lived on at the start. And actually that makes a big difference as to how we start our work in thinking about the way we use standards. And also this really strong urge in organizations for solutioneering, to find a solution even before you've had time to think about the right question that you need to address. So the advantage of standards and the standardization proposition really is a chance for you to set up a common vocabulary to talk about issues, synthesize the right questions, understand that that you have an opportunity to discuss the evidence collectively and then to apply it in a way that everybody can understand. Now, when we talk about human capital and measurement, it is not a new thing. People have always thought about a way of capturing what is human and measuring that. And this image that I have of Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci is one that was drawn in 1400 and something. And he took this inspiration from an architect, Vitruvius. What he wanted was to try to capture what it was to be the average, if somewhat perfect man. And that, of course, then has consequences for things like how big do you build a building, a doorway, a chair, a table, and so on. And this, of course, this study of the human body and its measurement, anthropometry, is also used very heavily in modern architecture, because everything that we live in has got a certain kind of measurement and standard. So the height of chairs, tables, the nature of stairs, the gradient, everything has a standard. And this is based on what works for the average human body. Now, standards, as we all know, don't come are nested in one another. So in order for certain things to work, I rely on a standard that's already established. Measurements about height, weight, length, all of these are taken for granted, but without those, standards can't function. And they're nested within one another. And because of the utilization of standardization, it is distributed unevenly across different societies and different economies. And for some communities of practice, those standards that we set are useful, and sometimes they are not. Because if you think about some of the standards being set in, say, profiling of people, those standards and those stereotypes have been used in profiling people, some communities, and you can see that some of these were highlighted in the Black Lives Matter movement, that these standards are then used, politicized, and used in a way that it was not, but perhaps intended for. Now, one of the things that I wanted to showcase was the British Human Capital Management Standard, based on BSI 6000. It is a standard which allows us to look at the principles under which people management can take place. And this was a very tricky thing, because for us to try to imagine standardizing management in a way that, and people in a way that does not reduce them to a widget, a thing, or an input-output model. So we started by thinking, okay, we need to establish some clear parameters of what we meant by good management. And under BSI 6000, we set out certain principles. And these are the principles embedded in 76,000. It was probably the first time that this kind of ethical principles were established in a standard. And then what took place was a long and difficult debate as to how we wanted to position this. Was this based on human rights? Was this based on the value that people brought to the table in an organization? And those debates took place within the committee for several months before we agreed that that was exactly, that this encapsulated the purpose of developing human capital management standards. And you can see the operation of standards in subsequent standards like 27,500, the Human Centered Organization. Some of these principles are less about ethics and more about the operating principles for that particular standard, but nevertheless, it has become fairly standard to use principles in guiding human-centered activity in the standards. The other thing that I wanted to highlight was the direction and focus that ISO and BSI have on sustainable development goals. And this, of course, gives standards a particular purpose in society, that they are not standards to be developed to the detriment of one of these goals. And some of the standards actually actively participate in contributing to some of these, pushing some of the dials for some of these things. And I've ticked off some of the SDGs, which are explicitly identified in the ISO TC 260 standards and the contribution that they make thereof. And these are some of the standards being made by that particular committee. So yes, let's start with here. So under BSI 6000, we have the core principles and values. And the first standard, the first value is, of course, extremely contentious, People working on behalf of the organization have intrinsic value in addition to their protections under the law and regulation, which needs to be respected. So this takes a human rights perspective that you have intrinsic value whether or not you contribute anything to your organization. And that is a kind of philosophical position that we take when we started working on these standards. And you can see these principles being used in various standards like 27,000 and 27,500, where you talk about the human-centered organization. And here the SDGs, and you can see the ones that are supported by the human resource management standards. So this is where I was going to just highlight all the different standards being developed under TC260 and how these contribute to particular organizational outcomes. But where it matters, you find that the standards that the UK are working on, we carry over into that space the principles that we established for the British standards. So Heather will talk later about the diversity and inclusion, these standards, and how principles have guided our contribution to the development of these ISO standards. One standard that is particularly influential is the Standard Human Capital Reporting that was published just over 2 years ago. And this standard actually highlights the importance of having data about your workforce, but data that is then presented in a way which is not focused entirely on productivity. It looks at various things like your well-being and safety as well. And this actually is of interest to a wide number of stakeholders. The stakeholders like investors, they want to know whether your workforce is being continuously developed and their human capital replenished. Policymakers want to know that you are not exploiting your workers, that you're actually contributing to the national skills base. It's of interest to potential applicants because it shows to the talent outside that you are interested in them and you seriously invest in your workforce. And of course, the data you collect about your workforce allow you to better operate the control units of your organization for efficiency and effectiveness. And over time, when you've got a lot of data about what works, what isn't working, and what needs to change, it helps you to make appropriate decisions about your organization development and design. So now we have a second poll, and I thought I would share this with you as a kind of reflection about the priorities in that particular standard. So the question is, what in your organization are the top 3 people metrics for your organization? So again, 30 seconds to just vote on what you think are the most important things you should know about your workforce. Okay, let's try to capture some productivity, health, safety, and well-being, and then turnover and retention. These are the top 3 that show up on my screen. So health, safety, and well-being is shot ahead, followed by productivity and turnover and retention. Okay, thank you. And you notice very interestingly that this is clearly a very informed audience. Workforce cost itself is quite low, but interestingly also sustainability. So these are the areas in which 30414 measure and provide information for your workforce. And you will appreciate that these are reporting standards. They don't actually give you the kind of WYSI analytics that you're looking at in some of the software that you buy from the market. But what it does is it gives the organization a means of talking about the value that your workforce brings to the table. So you find out how well they're behaving in compliance and ethics, the cost structure of your workforce, diversity issues, the leadership characteristics, organizational culture, health, safety, and well-being. And this is largely reporting about things like accidents, but also whether or not the workforce is suffering from other psychosocial risks. Productivity, recruitment, mobility, and turnover, because turnover tends to be an indicator of things that are happening or not happening in the organization. Skills and capability within your workforce, succession planning, and then workforce availability. And this standard has been used has been noticed by CFOs in the US, and more recently, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US has put human capital reporting on their regulations. And as of this quarter, the last quarter of 2020, members of the SEC have to report on their human capital. And so you can see that there is a recognition that the measurement of this particular resource is important for all kinds of stakeholders, in particular investors. And just to give you an idea of an introductory text to human capital management standards, you can see how broad these standards have grown in the last few years. So what I wanted to do in terms of just winding down is talking about the future of standards and standardization in this space. Now, in the book, we talk about a lot of things like artificial intelligence, human-machine interface, all the things that you would expect to find in the report on the future of work. But just to give some observations about the implications of all this change and all these drivers, what we find is because of the technology, because of the way we work, there is a network effect. We now have to operate across disciplines and professional boundaries if we are going to manage our people well. The other thing is that the nature of the organization is also changing. You know, in many of our standards, we look at the organization as the unit of analysis, and the standards apply to an organization. And yet, if you look at the way organizations work, they work between organizations. The value chain and the workforce is actually inter-organizational. And so the application of these standards and the way these standards are designed should reflect this much broader value chain. And in the D&I standard, BS 76005, we talk about how the standard applies to the organization, but it also applies to the way you operate with your stakeholders and the way that the value is created between these various organizations. And the other thing that emerged in the discussion in that chapter in the book on future of standards is the nature of belief systems, where you find that sometimes evidence isn't enough. There has to be a process of listening, engagement, understanding that people make judgments using their emotion, and also engaging in a conversation and a dialogue to build the trustworthiness of the standard and the evidence contained therein. So it isn't enough just to say this is evidence-based. In terms of application, in terms of adoption, in terms of understanding what really works, it's important to think about the engagement part. And ethics and principles, which I've talked so much about in this presentation. The reason why it's important to know the starting point of your work in standards is why are you doing it, as opposed to how you're doing it. So there are many standards that operate in the how, but really, as developers, especially standards that apply and impact on people's working lives, it's important to know why you're doing it and what your starting point is. So I've talked about how people standards or human capital standards lean on and are founded on principles and ethics and philosophy. and how these then become important building blocks for building back better. You can't just build back better without reflecting on why you're doing what you're doing. And I think in the human capital standards, a lot of thought has gone into this simply because we were talking about the sensitivities of managing people. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Wilson. So I think we've had a few questions come through. One of them here is from Paul Robbins. He says, it seems imagination and innovation are lacking at senior levels of management. How can HR impact at this level?
Okay. Well, first thing, I'm going to invite Heather to the table. I mean, she's instrumental in building some of these standards, and she knows those technical standards inside out. So, okay, so the question was about the lack of imagination. Remember, I talked earlier about how, we operate in system 1 and system 2. If you look at the evidence of leaders and managers, they operate mainly in system 1. Very short term, very effective. I don't like this, or I feel this isn't right for our business. Then they find the evidence to back up their decisions. So one of the things that standards do is they provide you a framework or a scaffolding to reflect on the evidence fairly. But also in my job as a researcher in futures, I use various scaffolds to help people think longer term. And what you find is that by giving them a scaffold, a temporal scaffold to look beyond the next quarter or the next financial year, you begin to take quite different decisions, because sometimes you can take a decision now that may feel right, but actually it shortchanges the organization's resilience, or shortchanges it on another potential market in 3 years' time. And you've just cut away that capability that would have allowed you to make the transition in your business model. So, and you can see also in the way we talk about the pandemic, we talk about it wanting to end, we talk about the vaccine being a silver bullet. It is much easier to talk about silver bullets than it is to talk about the graft that goes into building a health system of tracking, tracing, and testing, where there's no shortcut, where you have to actually build it brick by brick, as opposed to a magic bullet. And we're just naturally attracted to a solution, a way that gives us a shortcut. And it's nothing to do with me or you. It's just the way that how we are wired. As to the question about creativity, it's easy to generate ideas. It's much harder to understand the consequences of those ideas. And that's where standards and futures thinking actually come into their own, because you need those scaffolding, those mental scaffolding to allow you to think longer term. It isn't easy. Heather, is there anything you want to add? You're muted.
Sorry. I'm trying to get some more imagination into top of organisations is quite a challenge, I would say, especially right now. But now is the time to be more imaginative, isn't it, as we've heard today?
It's very interesting that people are still talking about the world as if we will live in COVID times forever, and that the buildings, the estates, people are thinking, oh, should I sell my building? And again, that reflects that kind of short-termism. You cannot think beyond the now, and that is a problem, especially if you are a leader.
I think perhaps if a lot of organisations that have bought House 3000, which was about smart working, we'd have all been much better prepared for this last year, because we would have been ahead of that COVID curve, possibly in terms of working more smartly and working remotely.
That I heard earlier about somebody saying that the pandemic wasn't foreseeable, it was unprecedented. pandemics are not unprecedented. They've happened before and they will happen again. And pandemics were top of the UK National Risk Register for nearly a decade. What we did was that coincided with a period of austerity. And so the civil service ran a desk exercise as to what they would do if there was a pandemic. They just sat down and did a paper exercise. You compare that with Finland, when they saw that pandemics were part of their risk register, and they ran an exercise a few years ago where they got together industrialists, they got together third sector people, they got together the military, and they were in a room for 2 days working out who would do what when if this trigger is activated. And that builds national resilience because they rehearsed it. And that is the whole point about thinking through and having frames of reference, that you look at what your red flags are, decide on what it is that's risky, and then build the contingencies and rehearse. That's what builds resilience and the capability to respond. We just didn't have leaders who had the imagination to want to invest in something that probably wouldn't land during their watch. So why would you then spend money on it, especially during a time of austerity?
That's great. I think we've got another question here, which I think is really important, which is how can HR show to top management that respecting HR standards pays off?
Okay. I think part of it is also demonstrating to HR that it needs to innovate too, over the longer term. And part of the innovation is these HR standards, which are relatively new. So you find that some organizations have adopted some of these standards and are very, very happy with them because they've generated value for their businesses. And they tend to be a lot of SMEs. In organizations with a culture of data and analytics, where decisions are taken with data, this kind of conversation is much easier. So we have found examples of organizations where the human capital data is looked at together with other operational and strategic data to make decisions. So where you have a culture of data analytics as part of the top leadership's way of working, HR tends to play its role there because it has a fertile ground to explore how these analytics and how these data points work. Traditionally, the profession tended to use very basic data, turnover, sickness absence, headcount, and that would be it in terms of managing the workforce. Organizations that have done well in this pandemic are those who have driven the data agenda much further, because without data, it's impossible to do workforce planning in an emergency.
Do you have anything to add, Heather? Oh, I think you're on mute.
I am on mute, yes. No, I wasn't. I was going to say that it's the data and the evidence that if you present it to a top management team and convince them that there is an argument there that's substantive, then they're more likely to listen, aren't they? But then also we have the issue of marketing of standards as well, and how many organisations are aware that there are HR standards would be one question I think that needs to be addressed.
I think those are all the questions we have. So if anyone has any more, please just send them through. But yeah, it was really great.
If I could just add a reflection on this morning's keynote speaker and the panel discussion that ensued after that. I felt quite reassured because the International Standard on Diversity and Inclusion, which is about to go to FDIS status, so we're at the final hurdle, having had quite a lot of comments to get rid of, if you like, in a positive way. Some pushback on some of the content areas that we'd included, but I felt quite reassured from this morning's session in particular, but also on organisational resilience session which this afternoon, that we're on the right track, because the words that I heard about belonging, accountability, good governance, working inclusively, communicating inclusively, supply chain, the importance of looking after your stakeholders, all resonates with what we're doing in that D&I standard. So I'm hopeful that it will be well received once it's published. And of course, it is led by principles. These are the prerequisites, the fundamental prerequisites for establishing a principled approach to D&I in organisations. That's what we've tried to do in this standard, and hopefully it hits the spot.
I think one of the things that, just listening today and to all the different panels and speakers, it was so evident that they were speaking from a particular perspective of an ethical use of a treatment of people. Because if you look at all the standards that were highlighted today, all of them require some interaction, some action, some thinking, some input from people. And so the deployment and the use of people towards those organizational goals has to be managed well in order to get those outcomes. And hence, the relevance of human capital or human resource management standards across all the kind of business standards is evident, because without understanding the motivators, the hygiene factors, the way in which people judge and frame their judgment about their organizations and their managers, you can't expect to get the outcomes that you're hoping for.
It goes to the point of being a responsible organisation, doesn't it? A responsible business in an ecosystem, and where we've discovered in this last period of time, which has been difficult, that people are really critical to organisations, not only as consumers and customers, stakeholders, but in terms of the people that work for or on behalf of an organisation, and how we value some roles, which we now really understand how critical they are, but they're not valued in terms of their remuneration, perhaps. So maybe we have a rethink about how we value roles in organisations more going forward than we have done in the past.
Yes, and if you look at many of the organizations who had to respond during this pandemic in the way that they had to protect their workforce, I would be very surprised if senior teams didn't appreciate the contribution that they made at this time of crisis. One organization which we looked at up in Scotland, when they realized that this was serious, the first thing they did was to change their HRIS, their HR information system, to record characteristics of their workforce to help them support them as they worked away from the office. So did they need any kind of support? They needed particular bits of information which they didn't hold. So they had to redesign the system. And that organization redesigned its systems within 4 days in order to capture the information they needed to support their workforce, their dispersed workforce, so that they were safe and they would not be harming themselves working at home, not from home, but at home. They also then looked at the communication channels, two-way communication with their workforce. And they made sure that those who were out in the field in their vans, engineers looking at supporting pipes and stuff, where they didn't have access to a web based interface. They developed an app within 2 weeks so that they could, the workers could connect with each other and share information about safety procedures that they had developed or worked on, but also to then receive support information from HQ, and so that they knew where to turn to if they needed resources. So that kind of work that was done really on the hoof in a crisis situation by HR is remarkable. I mean, I think that many HR practitioners, in the face of a very fluid policy environment, the furlough was a nightmare to manage because you just didn't know whether it was coming or going. And it was HR who had to manage this fairly, give as much notice to their workforce as possible as they negotiated their terms of hours and when and where they could work. And then working with facilities to see how they could access what was a safe egress from the building. All of that was actually led a lot by HR during this crisis. So I really hope that that organizations have understood the value of a function that is people-facing.
Brilliant. Well, I think that takes us to the end of the session, really, unless there's anything either of you would like to add.
I guess just that if anybody wants to continue the conversation with Heather, myself, or with HCS1, you have our contact details, and we'd be more than happy to talk to you about our work or to share some of the stuff that we do.
Yeah, definitely. We definitely encourage any questions on our standards or our work, very much so. Well, thank you, Wilson and Heather. That was really brilliant, really informative and very relevant, I think, to this conference and the questions around the future of work. So yeah, I think that concludes our session. So thanks for everybody, and see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Thank you, Helena.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.